Managerial Accounting Example 5B, continued. Excuse me. We're going to look at requirement 4. Calculate and interpret the direct material quantity or usage variance and price variance for the year. So just as with before, we looked at why direct labor cost was different from the flexible budget. We're now going to look at direct material cost. Excuse me, and see why that is different from the flexible budget. Now here we've got a little bit of a twist with direct material. One of the things that we know about materials, if you think back to our budgeting video we did before, is that you can buy direct material in one period and use it in another period. So the amount purchased and the amount used are not necessarily going to be the same. And companies will have all sorts of reasons for buying and using different amounts. As we talked about in budgeting, sometimes we buy in this period to plan ahead for the next period. Sometimes we might get a bulk discount if we buy a certain amount, and so we buy a little bit more than we need because we save money overall. Excuse me. There could be a variety of reasons why we buy and use different amounts of material. So we have to adjust for that possibility. And what we're going to find is that if we buy and use different amounts of material, this particular number, the difference between $21,500 in the flex budget and the $193 of the actual, that's not always going to be exactly tied out to the dollar, because some of what we buy and use might end up going into or coming out of inventory. So we have to allow for that little adjustment. Let's go ahead and look at what we know. We know that we should have used $215,000 of direct material because we should be paying $5 per pound for our cookie dough, and we should be using 1 pound of dough per cookie. And so we take those two facts. We have $5 per cookie times 43,000 cookies is $215. Well, just like we did for labor, for material, we need to think about not just the cost per unit, but the cost per unit of input. In other words, we don't want to think about the cost of the outputs so much as we want to think about the cost of the inputs. So we're going to think about our price. And again, our standard price is going to be what we're told, and it's $5 per pound. We don't want to think about dollars per cookie because we're thinking about the inputs, we're thinking about materials, so we want to figure out the price per pound. And what we also want to think about for the, just like before, we had our standard quantity of hours, which was the number of labor hours per cookie times the number of cookies. Our quantity, our standard quantity, the quantity of input that should have been used to make the actual output, is going to be 1 pound of dough per cookie times the 43,000 cookies. So what that tells us is we should have paid $5 per pound and used 43,000 pounds. And so our total cost should be 5 times 43,000, or $215,000. That's our flex budget amount. Again, it should be the same amount, but we're sort of thinking about how we got there differently. We're thinking about the dollars per input and number of inputs, not dollars per output and number of outputs. So that's what we should have spent. Now, what do we want to do about actual results? I'm going to put an extra couple of columns over here. We're going to spread it out a little bit more. Our actual results for direct material are going to be a little bit different. If we think about what we did for our direct labor, the difference between our SPAC, our standard price of actual inputs, and our actual results, the difference between SPAC and actual gave us our price variance. Think about what we want to know for our price variance for direct materials. Our price variance is going to be used to evaluate the performance of the purchasing manager who's in charge of purchasing. So our actual results for purchasing should depend on the amount of material that was purchased. The purchasing manager is in charge of what's purchased, not what's used. So in this case, our actual results need to reflect that we bought 67,000 pounds of direct materials at $3 per pound. So we'll drop in here our $3 per pound and our 67,000 pounds. And so our actual results here we spent $201,000 on what we purchased. Now, this is where it doesn't exactly match up. We spent $193, or we used $193 worth of stuff in what we used, but what we purchased was a little bit more than that. So we spent we spent $201,000. This is our actual price times our actual quantity purchased. Remember, this is for our purchasing manager, so we care about how much was purchased. What do we want to compare our purchasing to? Do we want to compare our purchasing to the quantity that should have been used, or do we want to compare it to the quantity that was actually purchased? We want to compare it to what was actually purchased. When we evaluate the purchasing manager, the standard price times the actual quantity should be standard price times actual quantity purchased. So what we should realize when we're comparing our purchasing manager's actual price to a standard price is we want to compare the $3 of actual price to the $5 per pound multiplied by the 67,000 pounds purchased. So what this says is, according to our standard price, we should have paid $5 per pound, and we should have paid $335,000 for the material that was purchased. Instead, we only paid $201, so we got this at a substantial discount. If we do our subtraction problem, we see that we saved $134,000 on what we bought, and because that's a savings, we're going to call that a favorable variance. We bought it at a lower price than we expected to pay. This is our direct material price variance. And again, because a price variance is for purchasing, we want to compare our standard price to the actual quantity purchased. And what this does is it allows us to compare the $3 price we got with the $5 price we should have gotten. We can say, hey, purchasing manager, you got a very low price on the amount that you purchased. The other side of our variance, the quantity variance, which is called a usage variance for direct material, we want to compare the 43,000 pounds that should have been used to make our 43,000 cookies with the amount that actually was used. So we're told that 64,500 pounds of the material were used in making the cookies. So we're going to compare our standards, our flex budget, or our standard price times standard quantity. We're going to compare that to our standard price times actual quantity used. So here we have to do two different SPAC columns because we have two different amounts purchased and used, two different actual quantities. But we need to recognize that those quantities exist for a reason. The production manager is responsible for how efficiently the material was used. The purchasing manager is responsible for the price on the material that was purchased. So here we can see that the production manager used 64,500 pounds instead of 43,000 pounds. And the extra that was used, the 64,500 minus the 43,000, cost us at $5 a pound an additional $107,500, and we'll call that unfavorable because it was extra. And this is our quantity variance. For direct material, we often call this the usage variance. And so what that tells us is holding the price constant at the $5 that the production manager expected it to be, the extra that we used cost us $107,500. Now, if you go to the production manager and you say, why did you use so much extra material? A reasonable answer could be, hey, we used all these extra materials because the stuff that we got was such lousy quality. That's why it was such a low price. So these two variances could have a lot to do with each other. The cost savings from a lower price may well have caused the extra usage because the cost savings may have represented lower quality. In this case, overall, we ended up saving money because the $134 we saved is greater than the $107.5 that we spent in additional usage. So if that's all the impact was, we just bought lower quality material, we had more waste, and so we had to use more of it, it might not actually be a bad idea. It might be that buying this low quality material could be something that's beneficial for the company. We'd have to explore the overall quality and long-term impacts of buying this kind of material. But these are the calculations for how we would do direct material quantity or usage variance and price variance.